Hello, this is just a quick bonus video for the Rhine podcast. It goes along with part 10 of the show, and hopefully it will help you get a better feel for one of the major transitions in the history of government, how the Emperor Augustus used the ancient offices of the Roman Republic to put together the Principate, which is what most historians call the first 200 years of the Roman Empire. In the Roman Republic, there were really two governmental bodies: the Senate, made up of 300 to 600 of Rome's richest men, and the People's Assembly, which was a bigger body that was supposed to represent the interests of the poor, the Roman plebeians. There was no central budget for the Roman state, so it was the rich senators that provided most of the money to run the government out of their own pocket. The Senate had these elected positions, each with a different responsibility. The lowest on the ladder was the aedile, who was responsible for building new temples and roads in the city of Rome, and for putting on public games, like horse races, gladiatorial shows, etc. Again, these aediles had to fund all of this out of their own pocket, and they sometimes had to rack up huge debts to do so. The next highest position was the quaestor, and put simply, a quaestor was a glorified accountant. Next up was the praetor, which was basically a junior military commander, and these praetors would report directly to the consul, who was considered both the head of government and, more importantly for the very martial Romans, the commander-in-chief of the army. In the Roman Republic, there were always two consuls, and they served for a year. The People's Assembly, by contrast, only had one important position, the position of tribune. There were about 10 tribunes, and they led the People's Assembly, and they would sit in on meetings of the Senate. They had two very interesting powers. They could veto any motion the Senate tried to pass, and they were what was called sacrosanct, which meant that it was illegal for anyone, including a senator, to hurt a tribune. Of course, senators didn't care too much about that law, and when certain tribunes stepped way out of line, the senators weren't afraid to kill one of them and throw them in the river. Check out the story of the Gracchi brothers for more on that. Now, as you can probably tell by what I just said, there were plenty of conflicts between the Senate and the People's Assembly, but for the most part, things worked out quite well as long as Rome was just a little city-state with the farmland around the walls of the city. But once Rome began to expand, all sorts of stresses were put on this system of government. Over the course of a few centuries, Rome conquered most of Italy, Sicily, Greece, Spain, southern France, and even North Africa. At first, the consuls were responsible for the conquest and administration of these new chunks of land, and they were granted a power called imperium, which basically allowed them to use the army in any way they liked to defeat the enemy and establish a new province. Over time, these wars of conquest were too far from home, and they started taking way too long, so they demanded a multi-year presence of one general. Since Roman consuls were only elected for a year at a time, the system just wasn't working. So, the Senate created a new position called a proconsul, who was always a former consul who would finish the war, establish a province, perhaps build some roads and cities, and then come back to Rome as a private citizen. Remember how we talked about the Roman government having no state budget? Yeah, well, this is where that becomes really important. Because there was no military budget, the professional soldiers with the proconsuls were reliant on the proconsul for paychecks, and if the soldiers were lucky when they retired, the proconsul could get them a plot of land in the newly established province. That way, the soldiers could become farmers and eventually landlords. Smart generals knew how to use this new dependency, this new relationship, to create a firm bond of loyalty with their troops, and in many ways, the armies of Rome stopped belonging to the Roman government and started belonging to individual proconsuls and generals. This didn't cause any huge disruptions for a little while, until consuls and proconsuls started refusing to lay down their commands, their imperium. The first general who had this brilliant idea was a man named Sulla, and many other generals followed his example. The next major one was Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, and even while Pompey was still in his prime, a man named Julius Caesar made a similar move, keeping his army together in northern Italy after conquering modern-day France. Caesar eventually defeated Pompey and became dictator for life, but was killed in the Senate chamber by Brutus and a bunch of other conspirators. For the record, Julius Caesar never said et tu, Brute. Shakespeare did. Caesar passed down his money and his imperium to his great-nephew, Octavian, who became Octavian Caesar. Unfortunately for Octavian, many of Caesar's troops and officers remained loyal to a friend and former lieutenant of Julius Caesar named Mark Antony. If you've been listening to The Rhine and you've heard parts 7 through 9, you would know that these two men had a very complicated relationship. They were often friends, sometimes enemies, but Octavian eventually undercut Mark Antony, and he was the last great general standing. Octavian Caesar then rebranded himself with the name that we know today, Augustus, which meant the wise one, or the one who is set apart from all others. And when Octavian Augustus looked at the Roman state, he knew he needed to make some changes. First, he made sure there was only ever one man who wielded ultimate authority over the Roman armies, or basically, one man who stood over all the proconsuls and consuls. This commander-in-chief or warlord-in-chief position was called being imperator. It's where we get the word emperor. And of course, Augustus took this power for himself. At the same time, Octavian was given something that was more like an honor than an official position. He was allowed to be the first name called in meetings of the Senate, or in Latin, princeps. This is, of course, where English speakers get the word prince. Octavian needed a way to ensure his personal safety, so he wasn't killed in the Senate chamber like his great-uncle Julius Caesar. And he also liked the idea of vetoing anything that the Senate did that he thought was stupid. So, Octavian took the tribunician power for himself, and he positioned himself as the hero of the Roman people. That could actually be the end of our story, but there's one interesting complication I left out that became important much later in Octavian's reign as Augustus. There was this position in the Republic called the censor, which was usually held by an elder statesman. A censor was responsible for conducting population counts, the census, and for regulating the morality of the Roman people. Late in his career, Octavian/Augustus started using this power over morality more and more. Famously, he used the position of censor to outlaw adultery and even exiled poets like Ovid, who wrote about sexual relations between men and women. Anyway, that's it. That's how the Emperor Augustus used the existing mechanisms of the Roman state to make himself sole ruler without ever having to declare himself king or dictator for life. If you haven't checked out our podcast called The Rhine, then you should. Right now, we are focusing on the Romans and how they conquered France and parts of Germany. But over time, it will turn into a storytelling podcast about the contested frontier between France and Germany. Check it out on iTunes or Stitcher Radio. The links are in the description below.